If you've been struggling with Path of Exile 2 or just looking for the best way to level up quickly, kill bosses, or absolutely crush the starting campaign, then this build is probably the best thing you can play right now. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HGM here with what I've found to be the best starting class of POE2 for me that's simply melting through the game's campaign right now, and that is the Monk. Now, to be honest, I was a bit skeptical about this class myself. I mean, it's not technically a range class, so I thought survival might be an issue, but I was wrong there. I also thought that the damage for this class might be an issue starting off, and it is initially, but there are easy ways around that, which I'm going to showcase to you in this video. Once you work that out and you unlock your main damage combo, this build is simply insane and it's amazing for beginners. But that said, there is a bit of setup involved here, which is why I wanted to make this video to get you through the first few acts and off to the best start possible. As always, timestamps are provided below if you need to skip around or rewatch a section. And don't forget to check out our written guide over on the website, that's hacktheminotaur.com. But we'll start as usual with skills, and this is where I think the Monk requires some out-of-the-box thinking as you're starting out in Path of Exile 2. That's because the Monk's starting abilities, which you pick up at the beginning of the first act, are borderline unusable, I think, especially against bosses. Basically, I found myself struggling so much here on the Monk that I almost quit right out of the gate. For example, your basic attack, the quarterstaff strike, is very clunky, it's slow, it requires you to be in close melee range, opening your character up to taking a lot of damage from enemies before you have, solid defensive skills in place. Your next skill, called Falling Thunder, is also less than impressive at the start, which offers, some basic AoE damage and mobility, but requires power charges to really boost its damage effectively. So I wasn't really feeling this starting skill combo, and I was getting dunked on pretty handily by the opening boss, so I decided to try something completely different here, and that was switching over to the bow instead of the quarterstaff as your main starting weapon. And don't worry, we'll only be doing this at the very start of the first act until you reach around level 14 or so, when you unlock one of the Monk's best skills called Ice Strike. So yeah, we're going to get there very soon, but I highly recommend picking up a bow at the start of the game if you want to save yourself a lot of time and frustration. Now with the bow, you simply need two skills to overpower your Monk. First, you want to pick up Lightning Arrow. If you've seen my starting Ranger build or played a Ranger before, you know exactly how good this skill is in Path of Exile 2. Lightning Arrow chains damage to other nearby enemies or off nearby surfaces to basically start a chain reaction. And it's simply the best tool for clearing out enemies in the early game, which is going to greatly help the starter Monk do some actual damage and speed things up a lot. For support gems, you can pick up Martial Tempo here to increase your attack speed, and then combine that with Lightning Infusion to increase your overall damage with this skill. Now your second bow ability, which I mentioned, that's going to be Lightning Rod, and this just amps up the damage of Lightning Arrow even further, giving that skill more targets to chain off of. This one is especially good with support gems as well, like Scatter Shot to create more lightning rods, and then Magnified Effect to increase the area effect on each of those. But that's basically it for starting out. Open with a few lightning rods to drench the field in lightning, and then spam Lightning Arrow until everything is dead. Now, I know again, it seems a little bit off for the Monk playstyle, but trust me, this is going to save you insane amounts of time and frustration, at least until GGG can improve the starting Monk skill set. And again, this is only going to be until you unlock Ice Strike about halfway through Act 1. Now, until we get there, a few more utility skills that you can actually pick up to make things easier. That includes the skill called Frozen Locus, which is your basic, crowd control ability. This puts a giant ice block on the ground, which you can break for bonus damage when either you or an enemy hits it. It also spreads freezing to immobilize enemies in place more quickly. So this skill is actually very useful in Act 1 and even Act 2 because you can use it to block narrow passages and trap enemies behind, allowing you to deal damage more safely. You can even utilize this with the bow, and of course later on it synergizes really well with Ice Strike. Now, this is going to be greatly enhanced with the right support gems. In this case, I recommend Glaciation to cause even more freeze buildup, and then Deep Freeze for 50% increased freeze duration. But another early Monk skill which can be useful in some cases is Killing Palm. This culls enemies which are low enough on health, so that can be useful for enemies which have a bigger health pool, like bosses or rare enemies. But what I actually like more about this skill is its ability to gap close to targets from basically one full screen away. Now this is nice because even your best skill, Ice Strike, has a relatively short gap close range, and if you really need to freeze or kill a target fast, like a dangerous caster in the back line, then this skill can get you right up into their face instantly. So yeah, save this for big targets, even bosses, to save some time, and then keep it on hand to close the distance in emergencies. Early on, you can even slot a support gem here if you want, like Life Drain. That's going to give you some health back when you do kill an enemy with this skill. But as I mentioned earlier, once you pick up Ice Strike, this build becomes an absolute beast. Now, this skill does 3 quick strikes, which can freeze enemies, and also has a small gap closer component as well. So this is pretty much your bread and butter DPS skill from now on, and obviously it just gets better as you level up and add the right support gems. First, I recommend Martial Tempo. You can just move that from Lightning Arrow over to this skill. This is going to make your attacks hit 25% faster. And then I also recommend picking up the Rage support gem, which is a little bit more unique. This is going to help you really melt bosses. Basically, the way this works is it stacks up 30 times for up to 30% bonus damage when you're attacking consecutively with your staff. And then Ice Strike also counts as a staff attack, obviously. So you can have that built up pretty consistently with no downtime, especially against bosses, like I said. For clearing or a little bit later on when you unlock 3 support gems, you can also slot in the Ice Bite gem here for another 35% cold damage bonus when you freeze a target, which honestly, you freeze basic enemies almost instantly with this build. But one other thing you want to combine here is actually your first Spirit gem, which you should use to unlock the skill Herald of Ice. And with Herald of Ice active, frozen enemies will shatter when you kill them, setting off another explosion of damage. Now keep in mind that Herald of Ice is a support skill that you unlock by first defeating the King of the Mists in Act 1. You pick up the Gem Bloom Skull and then crush it to get 30 passive spirit for your monk, plus that Spirit gem, which again, you want to turn into Herald of Ice for the bonus cold damage. You can amp this up even further with something like Cold Infusion for even more cold, and if you happen to pick up another piece of gear with at least 10 extra spirit, you can also slot in something to improve your overall stats, like Clarity. This gives you 30% bonus mana regeneration. But it's these 2 skills, Ice Strike combined with Herald of Ice, that really begin to show you the true potential that this cold-focused monk has in Path of Exile 2. You should be freezing and shattering your way through packs of enemies by this time with ease to wrap up Act 1, though you still need a boss killer, and that's where the Tempest Bell skill comes into play. Now, by building up 4 combo points using Ice Strike, you can then smack a bell on the ground, which damages nearby enemies when you attack it. And not only that, but elemental damage, like your cold-based attacks, for example, deal extra damage of the corresponding type. So this will give you physical damage plus cold damage combined, and when you factor in your Ice Strike, also, cleaving and potentially hitting your target as well, that's a lot of damage adding up quickly. But again, I tend to reserve Tempest Bell for bosses which don't really move around too much, and it can melt them in just a few seconds, even in Act 1. When combined with Ice Strike, you can also use this very effectively against rare mobs too, for that extra damage just to melt them when needed. Now, in terms of support gems for Tempest Bell, you usually want to pick up Persistence to make the bell last longer. For your second gem, you can go with either Hourglass for more damage with a cooldown, or Overabundance to get an extra +1 to your bell to stack them more closely together. Though in the early game, I kind of prefer Persistence because it just makes your rotation easier. So basically, set up the bell and forget it and have that extra 40% bonus damage. But one more skill I need to talk about early on, which is amazing for crowd control, especially in Act 2 for more difficult maps like the Dreadnought, for example, is called Wave of Frost. This sends a wave of ice out in front of you, as you would expect, but with a very high chance to freeze. Now, eventually your Ice Strike will be so powerful that you really won't need this, but in Act 2, this skill can be a real lifesaver. So I do recommend slotting this as soon as possible. Basically, you can replace Frozen Locus with this, but in terms of support gems, you can then use Glaciation for even more freeze buildup, as well as Magnified Effect to make the wave hit even more targets. Basically, you just want to spam this skill on packs of enemies and freeze them quickly to help you avoid damage, and then you can just clean up everything with Ice Strike combined with Herald. So how do you put everything together and play the beginner monk setup? Well, again, I recommend starting with some type of other weapon than the default quarterstaff for the very start of the game. This can be just a simple bow setup like I talked about, lightning arrow combined with lightning rod. It's very simple, it's powerful, it lets you do damage from range, and this gives you time for your build to gain some more evasion and energy shield to have better defenses. Again, don't worry, once you get your first level 5 gem around the middle of Act 1, like I said, that's when you pick up Ice Strike. You combine it with Herald of Ice to start really pumping out that cold damage and clearing enemies quickly. And for bosses and rares, you're going to want to drop down Tempest Bell for the bonus physical and elemental damage. And that's basically, your nuke for bigger targets. For crowd control, again, like I said, you can use Frozen Locus in Act 1 and eventually switch that out for Wave of Frost around Act 2 to freeze multiple enemies from a distance, lock them down, and then also avoid damage and kill them off at your leisure. And don't forget, for that extra mobility, Killing Palm can be really useful for moving around the battlefield, getting to priority targets quickly, and of course for culling low health enemies. Okay, let's talk about starting gear and what you need to look for on the Monk class to have the best start at the beginning of the game. Now, obviously your main piece that you're going to be looking for is the quarterstaff. What sort of stats do you need on this? Well, physical damage is going to amplify most of your skills. That's because those skills take your total physical damage and then convert a portion of that to like cold damage, for example, with Ice Strike. So you actually want to look for a quarterstaff that has a lot of physical damage. So that stat line here, increased physical damage, is what you really want. Now, obviously, you can amplify that with runes. And so I have 2 of the physical runes tied into this. That's going to give me another 40% increased physical damage. So that's a really good start. And again, that's going to buff most of our abilities, even the ice damage ones, which again, those convert physical into cold damage. Now, you can find actually increased cold damage, increased to elemental damage, for example, that I found on this one. That's going to be a really good stat line to pick up as well. And then anything in terms of your raw stats. So in this case, I got intelligence. But if you got, dexterity, that would be really good as well. But yeah, physical damage, that's going to be the key component that you're looking for. Any type of upgrade to physical damage on your staff, that's ideal. Let's talk about armor pieces next. On the Monk class, in terms of like your passive tree, when we talk about that, you're going to see a lot of bonuses to both evasion and energy shield. So getting armor pieces that have both of those is going to be really nice because that's just going to scale up even further with those passive skill tree bonuses. So in this case, ideally, you're going to get something like a chest piece with both evasion and energy shield. Now, early on in the game, if you have just one of those, like a chest piece with evasion or a chest with just energy shield, that's totally fine. You can upgrade those later, but basically either of those 2 and then ideally both is what you want in terms of your defensive stats. Now, yeah, other things like maximum life, for example, maximum mana, those are going to be really good as well. And then, of course, attributes. This helmet that I picked up, I think in Act 3, towards the beginning was really good. It's giving dexterity and intelligence on top of max mana, on top of evasion and energy shield. So that's really good if you're able to find something like that in the campaign. In terms of your boots, we always talk about this movement speed, especially when you're starting out in Path of Exile 2. Really important, even more important, in fact, on melee setup like the Monk class. So yeah, try to get some movement speed on your boots as soon as possible. And again, either energy shield or evasion, ideally both. And I'll just mouse over a couple of the other items I've picked up so far. So you can see kind of what I'm holding on to at least. Now in terms of jewelry, a couple things to point out here. You can get jewelry like necklaces, for example, with spirit. And if you have any bonus spirit, this can be used to apply better gems to your spirit skills like Herald of Ice. So in this case, this solar amulet, 12 extra spirit, that is going to let me run an extra persistent gem on my Herald of Ice, for example, giving me like more mana regeneration. So you don't need to have that, but it is nice if you happen to find something with at least 10 to like 20 spirit. That can be a big help. But otherwise, your max stats, maximum life, max mana. Sometimes rings can get plus to all attributes. That's actually pretty nice. This one has increased cast speed, intelligence, mana per enemy killed is another really nice stat, especially to get early on the Monk class to help a little bit with your sustain. You can get that on jewelry, you can get it on weapons, you can get it on gloves as well. So that's another stat to look out for, but this is just, again, your basic sort of starting gear ideas to get you through the main story campaign. All right, let's talk about the passive skill tree next. So you can see in terms of ascendancies on this monk setup, we've gone with Invoker just to get that nice bonus to chill as well as cold damage. When we freeze enemies, we also create chilled ground. So there's some nice synergies, obviously, with the ice-focused monk build, and we'll be working towards Unbound Avatar for the ascendancy. But in terms of your starting passives, you can definitely start on the more defensive side of this tree, and I definitely recommend that if you are less experienced, because you can pick up a lot of evasion and energy shield here at the start. And then if you feel comfortable, you can just refund that later. And instead you can get stuff like skill speed. You can get a lot of crit damage bonus here, which is nice as well. Into flow like water with even more attack and cast speed, dex and int. More evasion and energy shield. A lot here for mindful awareness. And then we're just working over to step like mist. For that increased movement speed and dex and int, and then we do want to pick up the freeze buildup and essence of mountain for a little bit of extra cold damage, more increased freeze buildup here as well. From there, I recommend going down this way, down the path to get the extra attack damage. Blinding Strike gives you 24% increased attack damage, plus a chance to blind enemies. We can come back this way. There's a very nice node over here called Crashing Wave, 36% increased damage if you've dealt a critical hit in the past 8 seconds. That's huge. Moving up from there, we can actually work in some more elemental damage, and Echoing Frost is good. 30% increased elemental damage if you've chilled an enemy recently, and we're chilling enemies all the time on this build with Ice Strike. And then I also recommend for your defenses coming over here, picking up the energy shield nodes, as well as melding 40% increased max shield. Though this does have 10% reduced max mana, I honestly don't even feel that at all. From there, you'll want to start working your way out of the tree. A nice few nodes you can pick up here for reduced mana cost. This becomes more necessary once you get into Ice Strike and later versions of that skill. Conservative Casting gives you 8% reduced mana cost plus 20% mana regeneration. So this is really nice for sustain, just those 3 extra nodes. More damage can be found here. For example, tenfold attacks gives you a lot of extra attack speed, some extra strength as well. And then Killer Instinct, 30% increased attack damage when on full life. Should be at full life for most of the time on this build. And then 50% increased attack damage when on low life. That is really good. And then working your way up, we'll want to start focusing more on critical chance and crit damage. So nodes like True Strike, that's more dex, 20% increased crit hit chance. For the Jugular, 30% increased crit damage, 10 to int, and then over on to Deadly Force, 30% increased damage if you've dealt a critical hit in the past 8 seconds. So that's kind of where we're going once we get to Act 3 or so. You will want to get into Resonance as well. This will be very helpful on later versions of the monk build when you start using skills like Charge Staff and you're looking for different ways to generate power charges. But that's basically where the build is at right now at level 40, just to give you an idea, some different directions you can go. Hopefully that gave you some ideas of where to get started with your beginner monk build in Path of Exile 2. If you found this helpful or you learned something, do me a favor and crush that like button. It absolutely helps out the channel. It lets YouTube know to share this video with others, so much appreciated there. I've got at least one more POE2 video planned that's going to be the beginner warrior setup, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested, or hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when that goes live. But other than that, check the website. I've got written guides over there for all of my beginner builds for Path of Exile 2 and much more. That's hacktheminotaur.com. And as always, thanks again for watching. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.